joined us. So, kia ora. Ko kei taho. I'm the Executive Director of Hāpai Public, the Institute of Public Professionals Aotearoa New Zealand. We've recently changed our name from IPANZ to Hāpai Public. Check out while we've done this on our website. Nau mai, haere mai, ki Hāpai Public webinar with Ian Rennie, Secretary and Chief Executive of the Treasury. Today is our third in our series, Voices from the Centre. Please type your questions for Ian into the Q&A box. Kia ora. So I'm thrilled to welcome Iain Rennie to speak with us today. Ian has a long and very distinguished public service career, and at the end of last year was appointed as the Secretary and Chief Executive for the Treasury. Now, depending a little bit on your age, you may know Ian from his time as State Services Commissioner. That's the role we now know as the Public Service Commissioner, a role that Ian held for 8 years. Ian started his public service career at the Treasury in the 1980s, moving from an analyst position through to Deputy Secretary. And of course, he's now come the full circle, returning as Secretary and Chief Executive. Hey, Ian, that's a lovely story. It's great to have you join us today. So, Ian, a very warm welcome to you.
Thanks, Kay. It's great to be with you.
Well, let's get into it, shall we, Ian? I've got lots of questions, and I might just start into it. You all good?
Yep, all good.
Excellent. Why don't we just start with a few questions about you? You've got a very prominent role in the public sector. So, I think everybody's curious to understand how our leaders tick, and just a little bit about where you've come from. How about we start with just a little bit about your career pathway and how you came to be in your current role, and maybe you can share with us, how do you go about making your choices about where you go next along that career pathway? Thanks, Ian.
Okay. Thanks, Kay. So as you say, I started my career when I left university. I did an economics degree, and I joined the Treasury in the mid 1980s, and I then did, over the next 23 years, I spent my career basically in central agencies. So I had a couple of stints in DPMC. I've worked at the Commission, as you said. I came back to Treasury once when I'd been at DPMC. So I've kind of moved a little bit around, but worked in the world of central agencies. And then after I left the Commission, I essentially worked for myself as a consultant, both in terms of public sector reform work and economic policy work, through the Pacific, through Asia, into the Middle East. I did that for 6 or 7 years, and then when the Treasury job came up last year, I applied for that, and that was a sort of that was a difficult decision, because I was actually quite I enjoyed working in terms of the variety of cultures, contexts, issues as a consultant. At the same time, particularly because I've worked overseas, I have seen it firsthand, many of the unsettled things in our world, and kind of see that this is a really challenging time for New Zealand, and it will actually be challenging, I think, for the foreseeable future, and decided that, I could do good by coming back and, working with my colleagues in the Treasury to ensure that, we as one of the institutions of the state can do our job to support, governments navigate the really difficult challenges that New Zealand will need to successfully tackle in the next, 10 or 20 years.
There's a lot in that, Ian, that you've raised, and we might get to some of that later. Let's just stay with you just for a little bit longer. I'm curious, you've had a long, and as I said, a distinguished career. So what is it that still makes you get up in the morning? What is it that drives you?
I think I've always had, a strong belief in the value of public service. So for me, I'm a very values-driven person. I think many of us who work in the public sector are equally, values-driven. I grew up in a household. Both my parents worked in the health sector, and I think they passed that sense of mission and purpose, kind of on to me. And so for me, I feel very fulfilled when I'm working with others and making a difference, to my country. And that fundamentally, for me, is as much a driver now as it was when I was 21 and joined the public service.
Yeah, I mean, it's that passion, isn't it, about serving the public that we just see every day over and over, and it's impressive. Is there anything in particular? Is there anything that you particularly enjoy about the role that you have now?
I think one of the things about working in Treasury is that because at some point most issues that government faces have a financial or economic implication, is at some point most issues in front of any New Zealand government come in front of the Treasury. So one of the fascinating things about this organisation is that it gives you a lens into the breadth of issues that New Zealand governments are grappling with. And that's a really privileged position, just to see to have that context and breadth and the infinite fascination of incredible variety of issues that you get to work on.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's turn our minds a little bit to the Treasury, and let's just start with the basics, shall we? Can you just, in simple terms, the role and the purpose of the Treasury?
Okay. So the Treasury is one of the oldest organisations of the Crown. So after the treaty was signed in 1840, the colonial government, one of the first things they did was to set up the structures of government, and they set up two departments. One was customs and one was Treasury. So we've been in business for 185 years, and one of my narratives with our organisation is I see my role being transitioning our organisation so that when we get to the 2040 and the beginning of our third century of service, that we're well prepared. So we've been here for a very long period of time, and essentially the core business hasn't changed. At the end of the day, our focus is being a financial and economic advisor, to the government, and that's the role we bring. Governments need to make decisions bearing in mind multiple objectives, of which finance and economics is but one. But our job is to support them and give them great advice around the fiscal and economic implications that they take. There's about 600 of us who work in the Treasury across a really broad range of issues, and a broad range of actually skills. So we've got economists, we've got people who've got commercial skills, we've got people who have got finance skills. So we actually, one of the great things about working in Treasury is quite a broad range of colleagues that you work with, and we bring together to ensure that our advice is as complete as it can be for government.
One of the things you were talking about in that koro, Ian, was getting ready for 2040 and being prepared. So that leads me into thinking about where you are steering the agency. Can you just talk to us about your vision? What is it that you're wanting to achieve?
So we have what's called a paitata, and paitata is about how you navigate to a distant horizon. And for me, the context very much is, the next 10 or 15 years leading up to 2040 will be pretty turbulent for both the world and for New Zealand. And so in that context, the vision for me is the creation of a Treasury that supports whoever is in government through that period to make good quality decisions and do the best job possible to navigate New Zealand safely through these turbulent waters. And so what that practically means for us is really focusing on the biggest issues that both face us in an economic sense and a financial sense. So what I call the big rocks. So for example, something like retirement income or raising productivity. So ensuring our organisation doesn't get distracted by the fact that we have to engage on lots of issues, but keeps those big rocks in mind. We need to ensure that our capabilities are fit for purpose, and that's both having people who are really well trained in the core disciplines, really well supported by the increasing array of digital and AI tools that they can use to be more productive. And the third element is to recognise that we influence not just by doing our jobs well, but by working with others to have impact. And the others can be our colleagues in the public sector, and increasingly it's ensuring that the Treasury is outward looking so that we are working with those outside the public sector, whether that's private sector, whether it's iwi, whether it's NGOs, to ensure that we understand what's happening in the world of the economy and public services. We are learning from the insights of others, and we're bringing our expertise to the table. So for me, this is very much building on a platform that's in place, and at the same time recognise that we just have to do a much better job in the next 10 or 15 years because the circumstances that we face are just much more challenging.
So what keeps you awake at night, Ian?
I think the things that keep me awake at night are, how we ensure that public services can be sustainably delivered through time. The Treasury has said for a very long time that the existing pattern of public services is financially unsustainable over the long term. And to date, the policy responses haven't really effectively dealt with that reality. And that does keep me awake because at some point there's a rising risk that a government will need to take precipitate action to move to a more sustainable position, and that may well impact in a very negative way on people who are most vulnerable. So that keeps me awake at night, and ensuring that New Zealand can generate the living standards that mean that our young people, and I'm a father of a 14-year-old in year 9. I want my son to feel that he can live in New Zealand, have a fulfilling career, raise a family if he chooses. And so for me, what we do to ensure that the New Zealand economy is thriving, it's productive, people can earn good incomes by staying and living in New Zealand is really important. And we've got a lot of work to do on that front as well.
Flip side of the coin, if you like, if those are the things that keep you awake, most worry you, what most impresses you about what you see from your very privileged role, really, what you see of the public sector? What most impresses you?
Well, I think I'd say one of the strengths in New Zealand that we don't really call out enough is the strength of our size, i.e. that we're small. And I think sometimes we think about our size having negative characteristics, and that is true. But one of my observations as a consultant is I worked in some very large countries, and you get a sense of the almost impossibility of making change. In New Zealand, it is much easier to get, key decision makers or key influencers, together, in a room, and for us to mobilize. It's just that we don't kind of do that sufficiently consistently. So that impresses me about New Zealand and the public sector. I think the other bit about the public sector is one of the things that I missed, leaving and being consultant, is you're constantly impressed by the people, in a sense of both the skills that people in the public sector have, and at times I think we don't really appreciate how skilled many of our best public servants are. And what with that is what we were talking about earlier. It's the values that go with that. There's a sense of, strong values about commitment to liberal democracy, commitment to the rule of law, commitment to ethics and integrity. And those things are like, we can sometimes take them for granted, but they are, hugely important, both in terms of doing our jobs well, but also for promoting the value of public service to people who want to come in and work here, because there are very many values-driven people in our country, and public service is certainly a really good way for values-driven people to fulfill their purpose.
Thanks, Ian. Let's turn our minds now to central agencies. As you know, here at Hāpai Public, we're very interested in central agencies and how they are working. So I just want to dig into that a little bit more with you. And Ian, do feel free to offer any observations from your time as State Services Commissioner and the changes that you have seen through your career, really, and being engaged with central agencies over time. That would be, I'm sure, of great interest to our audience. So let's then just start with the Treasury. And can you just talk us through how the Treasury fits into what, we loosely call the centre? How does the Treasury complement and relate to the other central agencies?
So I think one of the key roles of central agencies is putting a picture around context and then sharing that context with other agencies and leaders so that everyone is really aligned about making the best decisions with a shared understanding of what we face. And each of the central agencies contributes, a piece of the puzzle. So, DPMC contribute the insight that comes from, supporting the Prime Minister and the Cabinet around the policy priorities that government faces. PSC brings, really deep knowledge about how agencies are tackling issues. And obviously we have the perspective around the sort of financial and economic issues that really span the sector. So part of our role for central agencies is a really important role is how we ensure that we are trying to join the dots in a way that helps us individually in terms of what we do, but increasingly important how we share that insight with other leaders through the sector.
So that actually leads me to one of the other things I was wondering about, Ian, which is really the relationship with the Treasury and other public service departments, that sharing and for other reasons you have relationships, of course, with public sector agencies. Can you just talk about those relationships? How would you characterise them? How do other agencies perhaps view the Treasury? How do you view them? How do you work together?
So I think, it's a really good question, Kay. I think, firstly, the Treasury has a very broad set of relationships. So we not only deal directly with all the 40-something departments through our Crown entity and an SOE monitoring role. We also have monitoring roles around roughly another 50 entities, working to around 11 ministers in that context. So we have a very broad set of relationships with the sector, and some of those relationships are what I'd call quite transactional, in the sense where we work with agencies around some of the regular rhythms and processes in the public sector. So obviously the budget is a really important one, but more generally some of the statement of intent, the kind of strategic planning processes that you see in the wider Crown entity sector. And so in coming into the role, one of the things for me is I'm trying to lift, I suppose, the balance of our engagement from, we need to continue transacting the business of government, and also at the same time we need to lift what I call the strategic engagement with agencies, so that actually we're lifting the period over which we're talking about how we work with agencies into the 3, 4, 5 years, because a number of the issues that we face, whether they're policy issues or their agency performance issues, they're not going to be sorted out in a particular budget cycle. And so it's really important to me that we strengthen the dialogue between Treasury and senior leaders around what are the critical medium-term issues that we jointly need to work on. So those relationships are, I think, it's lots of different entities, different levels of relationship, but I think part of the change that I'm wanting to see in my time in the Treasury is to, I suppose, strengthen the strategic dimension around those relationships.
And how do you feel that we're going with that? I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure that there's lots of nods going on in our audience, and you're trying to get beyond the day-to-day and into the strategic. How's that working for us? How would you rate progress so far?
Look, I think the processes of collaboration, engagement, look, they go in cycles. I think the COVID period had many challenges for the public sector, and I think part of the consequence of that was, in some senses, funnily enough, we became more siloed. And so I think there's a little bit about us kind of rebuilding about a common sense of purpose and how we kind of work jointly on the critical issues. And I think a key issue for central agencies about is how do we build that pattern of common understanding of strategy that actually can then guide collective action. So I think we're very much work in progress, and there's a lot more we do, because, as I said, right at the start, I think one of our secrets is our ability to exploit our small scale to make agile decisions quickly, and to do that we need to have that sort of, if you like, bedrock of strong relationships in place that allow us to leverage the asset of size.
Which then brings me to the other dimension of relationships. We've talked about the relationship with the Treasury as a central agency out and in with other public sector agencies. But then there is the central agencies themselves and how that works at the centre. Do you want to just describe to us, Ian, how you see that? Is the 5 central agencies, are they a system within the public sector system, or are they really operating to their own strengths, but just with particular different purposes to some of the other public sector agencies, if you get my drift?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a mix of both. We, as central agencies, we each have particular jobs that we have to do, and that falls to each agency to undertake that work. And I think, certainly, my relationship, particularly with, Ben and Brian, is how we then see the value whereby working collectively, we can have greater impact than working separately. So, and then part of the other dimension then is that we have two new central agencies in the picture in terms of Ministry of Reg and SIA. And I think, we're still working through essentially how do we as a five work together, where are the points of leverage where we can kind of collectively work together. So, I think, compared to many other agencies, the central agencies are themselves relatively small agencies. So we have to be quite targeted about, how much we coordinate and engage as a collective, because we have quite limited resource, and we each individually have quite big spans of responsibility. And so, it's always something that we need to work on, is actually working out where we can best, engage and as a group, and how that can help the system go forward.
And Ian, we've just had a question come in from the audience that's directed at this point of relationships across the sector between agencies. So I'll put this question to you now. When the new Ministry of Regulation was established, the intention from the Minister that it would be a central agency was highlighted, presumably to give perceptions of its advice more weight. Does the idea of central agencies elevate some ministries above others, perhaps diminishes perceptions of other non-central agencies? What would be your response to that question?
No, I certainly don't think about central agencies being, in a sense, hierarchically different from others. I think the value that the centre brings is because each in our own way is that we look right across the system, and there is insight and value that comes from that broad system role, and that just recognises that's the nature of the centre. Now, the issue is not that is a perspective that is inherently more important than an agency that has, very well connected with its sector or own system. It's very much, I think, complementary, and that's, I think, how we, I think, would see our roles. It's not really, if you like, lording it over others. It's about bringing a perspective that is respectful and complementary to the perspectives of individual agencies.
And given your length of service and engagement with central agencies over many years now, what sort of changes have you seen? That type of relationship is kind of what I'm interested in trying to get at here. Any observations from you?
Look, I think, as I said, how central agencies work together, it goes through cycles. But actually, if I go back, 2 or 3 decades, I think central agencies were much more distant from each other than is the case, now. I think there is much more routine connection, particularly around the big performance issues that face government, around the agencies that are needing most support or facing, greatest, change. So I think we've moved a long way as central agencies about how we work together, and I think it's been wholly positive. And I think there's opportunities to certainly, go a lot further. I think, there's also been, I think, a deepening of central agency relationships with the with the wider public sector system and acknowledgement about I suppose our convening role. So when I was Public Service Commissioner, I instituted a regular, meeting of chief executives where we got together 2 or 3 times a year for, a couple of days. And, when I first did that, one of the bits of feedback I got was, well, people thought that I needed to hand out nameplates because otherwise they won't know their colleagues. No, actually, I think, we don't need that now. And I think that says something about how over time central agencies have been evolving their relationships with other agencies. They're probably less distant and less aloof. But as I say, I think certainly from a Treasury perspective, we can do a lot better about raising the quality and focus of those relationships going forward.
It also, to me, that point you've made about the sharing of context is oh so absolutely critical. And of course, as you've just illustrated very well then in terms of just simply knowing each other's names, through the leadership group, through the chief executive group is obviously a powerful mechanism. Do central agencies, have you reflected on engagement in other ways more broadly, sort of through a slice or through the public sector, in order for the public sector to really be able to share and understand that context?
I think there's work in progress there. I mean, one of the things I'm actually doing at the moment, Kay, is that I'm going out with the relevant colleagues from the Treasury, and we're sitting down with a number of CEs and their senior teams in agencies, and that for me is incredibly valuable, where we can get to talk about that issue about context. It goes beyond the chief executive, and we can kind of talk about shared objectives and shared issues. I think the other piece, which I think, and I think there's a lot more we could do about leveraging our insight across a broader range of leaders. The other part is to ensure that we are don't just keep our context to ourselves in the public sector. So, one of my observations is that compared to probably a lot of other countries, the public sector and private sector in New Zealand, in some respects, are more distant. And earlier this year, Brian, Ben, and I, we went up and we spent an evening with a group of senior business leaders in Auckland, and we just talked about perspectives about how government was working, etc. And that was really good engagement. But one of the things that surprised me a little bit was how new that was. Whereas I actually think if we're doing our job well, that's just part of our role. So our contribution to the public sector is not only about how we work with agencies, but also how we support the public sector to be more outward looking with the other sectors that we need to partner with.
I'm curious about this fact. It was raised at an event we held at the end of last year, actually. It's a year in review event, Ian. And Chris Bishop and also Barbara Edmonds both really made the point about wanting to make sure that the advice they received exactly did what you were just talking about. So yes, receiving that advice from their public officials, but their point was they expected their officials to have talked with those people beyond the public sector, the private sector, the community sector, and so forth, and to bring those views to them. And I do still remember Barbara Edmonds specifically saying, because sure as eggs, I'm going to talk to them. Mm-hmm. How do you think we're going? You've indicated that, well, actually, perhaps we're still tagging on to this idea. How do you think we're going on that? Is there anything that we should be doing to help the public sector be able to do this well?
I'd say it's a mixed picture. I think, I think in many ways the public sector, around specific issues does often engage with, parts of the wider community who are impacted by that change and have relationships with those sectors that they do bring to the table. I think I hear a couple of things. One is that sometimes the public sector is too closed about what it really thinks. And I think there is a real challenge for officials about how much we share, how we think about an issue in a way that doesn't, I suppose, get in the way of our role as a trusted advisor to ministers. And I think you can do that, but I think that needs to be done well. And then I think there is a real thirst that I get from other sectors for more of a strategic conversation about what are the really big, as opposed to the particular issue at hand. What are the big issues that an agency is working on, that the government as a whole, or the service as a whole is working on, and how can people understand the sort of thinking that we bring to bear to those issues. And I've found that, particularly since I've been in role and I've been talking about some of both the fiscal and economic challenges that New Zealand, faces, and I've had really positive responses from, particularly the private sector, just because they actually think that should be a role for the public service, and they find that really interesting in a way that they can begin to connect with the debate. And I think for us as a public service, we need to come back to thinking about how are ministers influenced. And we don't live in a world anymore, if we ever did, where policy gets set by officials engaging with ministers in a slightly monastic process, and then it gets announced to a surprised world. I think the policy process is much more porous than it used to be, and I think that's overwhelmingly a good thing. So that means for us as a public service, we need to recognize that and think about how do we both respect our roles that we have, particularly with respect to ministers, but also a reality that we are open and transparent agencies, and people expect us to have views and want to understand how we think about the big issues that we all work on.
Thanks, Ian. A specific question for you from our audience. What are your thoughts on the investor confidence rating transition, the ICR, and what options there are for non-bricks and mortar, big digital investments that can be safely delivered? So a very specific question for you there. Any thoughts, Ian?
Oh, I'll answer that in a couple of general ways. I think we're making a number of changes about how we organise ourselves in the Treasury, and part of that is to ensure that the investment management system is really well connected with the other key processes that we run, particularly around the budget, and also that those processes are both fit for purpose, because we hear a bit about some of those processes are a bit burdensome for agencies, and we need to listen to that. But also that we need to make sure that the pattern of investment of government, going into the future, will be both the same as it was in the past, but it will also be different, in particular in respect of digital investments. So I think we certainly need to think about how those management systems that we have are essentially fit for purpose in terms of the kind of investment that government needs to make into the future.
Thinking about fit for purpose, then, what does a future public service that is fit for purpose look like to you?
I think there's a future public service I mean, if you look at that, I mean, it's because of the financial constraints that government faces. You know, the public sector in the round is more likely to be smaller over time than larger over time, as government essentially rebalances what it spends taxpayers' dollars on towards, you know, pensions and healthcare and defence, and away from other elements of public spending. So you have to think about, okay, how can you stay being a capable public sector, even if you are a smaller public sector? And that then, I think, speaks to how we both are really supported well by, you know, digital tools, you know, AI, which, because a lot of the public service is knowledge workers, the broad changes around digitization, machine learning, AI, etc., you know, are really important enablers for us about being more, you know, capable. I think the public service needs to ensure that we are, in terms of being fit for purpose, that we are we connect with all the pools of talent across the country for us to do our job. So, you know, for me, you know, in the Treasury, one of the things that I think quite a bit about is that because we need to tap into a lot of financial and commercial skills, reality is a lot of those skills are located in Auckland, they're not located in Wellington. So there's a little for us about what does the public service look like if we're truly inclusive around leveraging all the talents that we see in New Zealand. So I think the public service looks, you know, different, both in terms of makeup, location, how we use technology. But then I come back to the last point is, or two points. One is this issue about engagement beyond the public sector. You know, for me, it's fundamental that our purpose is to deliver services for the country as a whole, and we can't do that job well unless we've got a whole lot of relationships in place that give us real insight into what people really need and how we can work with others to get the best outcomes for New Zealanders. The final point is, you know, public service at the end of the day is grounded on ethics and integrity, and a fit for purpose public service has to be one where we are truly confident that we're a low corruption public service, that we're committed, you know, in a very deep way to the principles of supporting democracy, around transparency to the public, to ministers, to the parliament. So, you know, those things I think are really fundamental in terms of being trusted. And for me, they will continue to be part of a fit for purpose public service.
Picking up on that point about integrity, Ian, in your career, what's your observation in terms of, has that gone up, down, or are we about at the same place as when you entered the public sector? What do you think?
I think without question, our challenges around integrity, you know, rise through time. You know, I think, and in some ways, I think we, because in many ways we're still a high integrity public service, you know, we're a little complacent about the risks to that. I mean, it's interesting now that if you look at Australia, all Australian states and the Commonwealth all have independent commissions against corruption. We don't. But I wouldn't say that our Australian cousins are inherently lower integrity than we are. And so I think, you know, I mean, as our society has become more diverse, I think there are pressures which are more prominent on particular public servants who are at the front line around some of the really hard issues. I think, there are greater pressures on public servants than when I started my career. And so for me, these issues about integrity, we cannot be complacent, because the risks around them are significantly greater than in the past.
A question, very specific questions come in, Ian, so I will put this to you, as we said we would. The Living Standards Framework and Te Ara Waiora have bounced around a lot over the years at the Treasury as methods of bringing forward longer-term holistic economic advice as opposed to the more narrow fiscal advice. What's your view about the status of these frameworks given their inconsistent implementation to date?
First point is, I think for a Treasury to do its job well, even as a financial economic advisor, it needs to understand the outcomes that government is trying to achieve. And government is always trying to achieve outcomes that are broader than ones that can be measured solely in financial economic terms. And so Te Ara Waiora and also the Living Standards Framework are ways in which we can think about those broader outcomes when we actually frame our advice to government. So they continue to be really important. It's one of the things I've signaled to the organisation that I want to kind of refresh and reinvigorate that work and think about how it can be applied in a way that basically reaches more of our business, because I think that has been one issue that you can kind of see how these frameworks can support, some parts of our business. Some of the connections in other parts of the business are less clear. So I think that partly explains the inconsistency. And I think it's really important that these are tools that whoever is in government, they can sort of see that actually they're frameworks that can be applied that will help government make good decisions. So in that sense, they're frameworks that are able to be applied across governments that have quite different values drivers. And I think that's part of our thinking, that we need to think about how do we best do that.
I want to sort of close out with a few questions, Ian, really pulling on your sage advice. You still have a very successful public service career. And of course, the public sector is made up of public professionals. It's real people with a passion doing real mahi every day. So just a few questions for you to help those real people on their career pathways. First up, what do you consider to be the top 3 attributes of a successful public sector leader?
So the 3 I'd choose, Kay, would be firstly authenticity. So one of my managers in the past, he said to me, look, there are many ladders to heaven. And I think what he meant by that is actually our leaders don't need to fit in a particular personality type. People will follow leaders who are authentic, that people can have trust in, who, they're not pretending to be someone that they're not. And so authenticity, I think, is really important in a public service leader. The second point is around integrity. So that point about, because, our shared work is very much values driven, public service leaders need to be able to convey that sense that they have personal integrity around how they make decisions, even though those decisions might be quite difficult and challenging. But if those decisions are made in a sense of integrity, I think there is more of a, I suppose, confidence in leadership. And thirdly, the third characteristic I would use is humility. I think there's a lot of literature around that as individuals, we all face, cognitive biases, blind spots, and actually good decisions require leveraging the insights and perspectives of, a wider group. And so in that context, leaders need to not shy away from making decisions, but they need to come to the table with a sense that they don't have all the answers and to be genuinely open to the perspectives of others.
Kia ora, Ian. Great advice. So if you were 25 today, what advice would you give to your 25-year-old self?
I think the first thing to think about is to think about, in terms of career runway, you have a long way to, run. And I think, our conception of the length of careers has changed a huge amount and is continuing to change. So someone who is 25 conceivably has, 50, 55 years of active work experience in front of them. Having said that, so that means as a 25-year-old, actually you can have the importance about investing in opportunities that will position you for that really long term. So for the 25-year-old, I think it means being prepared to take a bit more risk. Maybe it's going and working in an area that looks interesting, but hey, it's not something I've done before. Maybe it's moving out of the public sector and going and working in that private sector company. Maybe it's working in that iwi organization. Maybe it's going overseas, So in a sense of the 25-year-old, in some sense, whoever she or he is, should have the confidence about, well, actually, I'm here for the long haul. I have the ability to kind of shape my career in, many ways. One of my observations about, when I became a consultant, I realized that, one of the best tools about being able to brand yourself as an individual was LinkedIn. And I can't say how much work I've got a lot of work through just LinkedIn. And the world we're in technologically is providing individuals with lots of ways in which they can present their skills, either to organizations, but individuals don't need to be bound by thinking about themselves as connected for life to an organization. So I would say, look broadly, look widely, experiment, and think about that really long term.
The final question before I do a wrap in, do you have any specific requests of public servants?
I think it goes back to, the challenge. I think, going back to what I said about coming back to the public service, is that, New Zealand faces some really big challenges, and we need to be honest about that. And it's sometimes, because New Zealand's a great country to live in, those challenges can look quite distant, but they're not. So I think there's something for all of us about how we keep focus on the outcomes that we're really here to achieve through our public service. Are we really, can we go home each night and say, actually, no, I did my best to make a difference, and I know what I need to do to be more effective in that way. So I think that's a big part of it. I think the second part of it is this issue about integrity and trust, about, am I, as a public servant, operating in a way that I think is wholly trustworthy? And do I, as a public servant, do I speak out when I see behaviours that don't accord with that, whether it's in my workplace or beyond? So, in a sense of, it's that old saying, bad things happen because good people do nothing kind of thing, you know. And I think there's something for us about we're all active stewards of a vibrant public service. And so that would be my request of every public servant, is to think about what does it mean for them as an individual.
Kia ora, Ian. Look, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed our chat. I look forward to bringing everybody the next voice from the centre, and that's going to be Gráinne Moss from the Ministry for Regulation on the 19th of August. Sign up on our website if you haven't already. And just to give you some blatant promotion of some future upcoming events, we have our Parliament in Practice one-day workshop coming up on the 7th of August. If you or your staff would benefit from a full-day session to really understand how Parliament works, I thoroughly recommend this course to you. We have the Minister for the Public Service, Judith Collins, speaking to us on the 28th of July. Unfortunately, we are full up, so my plea is, if you have registered but can no longer make it, can you please let us know so we can free up your seat for somebody else. Thank you again to you, Ian, for your free and your frank and your forthright views that you've shared with us today. That's very much appreciated. Thanks very much for your time. It's been great having everybody join us. That's all from us today. Mā te wā.